Thank you. Caroline Jones.
Diolch, Dipper Llywydd. Thank you for your statement, Cabinet Secretary, and thank you to the individuals who have suffered and campaigned avidly on this topic. I welcome the appointment of Mr Justice Langstaff and the fact that he will be a full-time chair of the inquiry. The contaminated blood scandal is one of the darkest periods in the history of our NHS. The fact that people sought help from the health service were exposed to deadly viruses is shocking enough, but the fact that they've been denied a proper explanation as to how this was allowed to happen is inexcusable. Mr Justice Langstaff clearly intends to right this wrong. He has promised a thorough examination of the evidence behind the major scandal. I also welcome the fact that he has indicated that the process needs to lead to a full report within the shortest timescales that such thoroughness can accommodate. This is very much welcomed. It's disappointing that it has still taken nearly a year to get the inquiry up and running after the government made the announcements. Victims of the scandal are still dying, and the longer this goes on, the more victims will be denied answers and justice. In fact, in the same time since the inquiry was announced, another 60 victims have sadly passed away. I am grateful that Mr Justice Langstaff acknowledges this and has started the consultation on the terms of reference before he takes up the full-time role on the 1st of May. I'm also grateful that he is consulting the victims and their families. Those like my friend Faye Denny, whose brother has now sadly passed away, means that Owen Denny will not get the answers or the justice he deserves. But I hope Faye will. I have just a couple of questions, Cabinet Secretary. We don't know how many others who receive contaminated blood contracted an infection but remain undiagnosed. What is the Welsh Government doing to help identify these victims? And have you discussed this with Mr Justice Langstaff? What assistance can the Welsh Government give in publicising the inquiry and facilitating evidence sessions in Wales? What can the Welsh Government do to assist the inquiry investigate the role of Professor Arthur Bloom and the Cardiff Haemophilia Centre in exposing haemophiliacs to HIV and Hep C? Professor Bloom was well aware of the risks of administering contaminated factor and said that it is therefore very important to find out by studies in human beings to what extent the infectivity of the various concentrates has been reduced. The most clear-cut way of doing this is by administering those concentrates to patients requiring treatment who have not been previously exposed to large pool concentrates. He is believed to have experimented on patients at the Cardiff Haemophilia Centre, which now bears his name. Professor Bloom cannot be called to give evidence as he passed away in 1992, but can you assure us that all his notes and records from the centre will be made available to the inquiry? Thank you once again, Cabinet Secretary. I appreciate all that you are doing to ensure that the victims and their families get both the answers they need and the justice they deserve. Thank you.
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you for the comments and the two particular areas of questions. With regard to the Cardiff Haemophilia Centre and its practice, again, I reiterate what I've said to both Angela Burns and Rena Bjodworth, that any records and information that NHS Wales holds will be made available to the inquiry. There's no attempt to try and hide away from any of this, and it must be for the inquiry and individual stakeholders who will give their evidence to place that in front of the inquiry then to reach conclusions. On the point about undiagnosed victims, given the length of time that would have elapsed from potential exposure, I would expect that it would be fairly unusual for people not to be symptomatic at this point and not to be diagnosed. You can't necessarily avoid the prospect, but given that we're talking about a specific community of people who will have had blood products, I would expect that people would be aware. If others do come forward, then we'll know. But there isn't a particular programme at this point to try and run through and look for undiagnosed victims. That's not a matter I've discussed with Mr Justice Langstaff. I actually think, given what we know has happened and the number of people affected, we have a significant job of work to do already. And any lessons from this inquiry would equally apply to anyone who comes forward at a later date who may have been affected but undiagnosed from the scandal that took place in the 70s and the 80s.
Thank you.